In 1962, France pulled out of Algeria, ending 132 years of occupation. Its withdrawal from the North African country seemed to echo actions taken elsewhere in Africa and Asia, including the withdrawal from Vietnam in 1954. At its height, the French Empire ruled over 150 million people across the globe and covered up to 5.2 million square miles, making it the second largest empire in the world after the United Kingdom. Much like with Britain, many assumed the French Empire ended in the 1960s. However, between 1960 to 2014, the French military intervened across Africa up to 50 times. In 1990, some 28 years after the withdrawal from Algeria, Paris had troops stationed in over 22 African countries and military bases located at strategic points across the continent. While the reasoning changed over time, from keeping communism out of the continent to fighting Islamist extremism, France's role in North Africa has been considered crucial to various Western countries, especially to the United States. But with failed interventions in Mali and Libya, and with Morocco and Algeria having various disputes with Paris, and with other countries ranging from China and Russia to Italy playing a bigger role in North Africa, has the French encore come to an end?
C'était même un moment historique puisque l'Amazigh a fait son entrée.
آلاف الفرنسيين في مظاهرات في جميع أنحاء فرنسا.
Where we're looking into that untranslatable word, francophonie.
The end of empire and the rise of the newly independent states led to France scrambling to carve a new role for itself in the world. No longer a metropole, Paris's global status was much diminished, and with the Cold War being led by the United States and the Soviet Union, there was a sense that Europe was no longer the place that made history, but rather a place where history happened. By the 1950s, a new term took off, Francafrique, which would suggest a new role Paris would play in the post-empire world. Coined by the leader of the Ivory Coast in 1955, Francafrique would turn African countries from colonies into spheres of French influence. The Cold War and the fear of the spread of communism meant the United States regarded Paris as an important partner for managing Africa. Developing close personal ties with African leaders, Paris emphasized its military, economic, cultural and political ties across the continent. In 1939, the French Treasury ensured it would have control over the monetary supply of a number of Central and West African countries by launching the CFA franc, divided into the West African CFA franc and the Central African CFA franc. During the Second World War, the French franc lost a lot of its value, and in 1945 it was further devalued after Paris endorsed the Bretton-Woods Agreement, which fixed the franc's exchange rate with the US dollar. There was a fear that this would hit French exports, and so creating African versions of the franc would ensure Paris's export dominance in the continent. Today, 14 African countries still use the franc, including countries that were never French colonies. Agreements reached with different countries meant the newly independent nations would rely on France to build their national armies, and the French military would also guarantee protection from internal and external threats. Countries accepting French help found they were unable to export their raw materials to any other country other than France, and were forbidden from selling to third parties. After the Cold War ended, France struggled to maintain its level of engagement with African states. In 1994, it decided to devalue the CFA currency, sparking anger in countries that used the money. The move increased economic instability in the Francophone countries and caused inflation. It was reasoned the CFA devaluation would be good for the African countries that used the currency, as there were concerns the CFA was artificially high. It priced them out of the global market and made them less competitive. The move to devalue the currency was opposed by the then French President Jacques Chirac, who feared it would weaken French influence in Africa. Losing influence in Africa is a key concern for the French, and North Africa in particular features prominently in the discussions around Paris's Africa strategy. Despite changes in the post-Cold War world, France's North African policies remained stable until 2011, when the Arab Spring broke out. Since December 2010, Tunisia has been in the grip of large-scale anti-government demonstrations, and security forces are struggling to maintain order, triggered by the suicide of Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire after the police took away his cart, leaving him unable to earn a living. Nothing President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali did was able to calm the outpouring of anger at his regime, and demonstrations kept on spreading. On the 14th of January 2011, Ben Ali, who had ruled Tunisia since 1987, boarded a flight bound for Saudi Arabia. It was widely reported at the time that he was initially bound for France and landed in Paris, only to be refused entry by local authorities. However, there is no evidence he went to France or intended to go there. In fact, leaked telephone conversations between Ben Ali and a number of his officials and key advisors seem to show that Ben Ali was not intending to flee the North African country. While on board, he discovered his Prime Minister had gone on TV and said Ben Ali was temporarily unable to exercise his duties as president and that the PM would assume the role. The fall of Ben Ali's regime acted as a catalyst for protests in Libya, Egypt, Bahrain, Syria, Yemen and elsewhere. The Arab Spring, as it was known, proved to be challenging for Western states too, as they were caught off guard by it. France was taken completely aback by events.
The Arab Spring took many international powers by surprise, and they were not ready to see these development in the North Africa.
When the revolt started in Tunisia in December, the Minister of the Interior, Madame Marie, was proposing in Parliament that the French use some of their know-how in terms of the gendarmerie to go and help the Tunisian leaders master the crowds, and she lost her job within 24 hours. The French missed the boat about the revolution or the change in Tunisia, where the rioting. They just missed the boat completely.
Missing the outbreak of the revolution in Tunisia was particularly embarrassing for France. After all, between 1881 to 1956, the North African country was under a French protectorate. Following Tunisia's independence in 1956, Paris remained deeply immersed in the country, both at the institutional and social levels. Ministers, politicians, civil society figures, businesses, NGOs, security forces and the military had deep ties to France. Cultural, economic and political elites are part of the Francophone orbit. In 2008, French President Nicolas Sarkozy heaped praise on Ben Ali and Tunisia, claiming the space for freedom was expanding in the country. Yet US diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks in 2010 tell a different story. Tunisia was highly corrupt, and dissent and criticism were quashed. But this did not stop Paris from deepening ties with the regime. Sarkozy launched the Union for the Mediterranean, which would foster closer economic and political integration between the European Union and North Africa and the Middle Eastern countries. Tunisia was a key part of it, and Paris needed it to be part of the Union. By 2011, there were 1,200 French companies operating in Tunisia and some 22,000 French citizens living there. A revolution would put these interests at risk.
Notes that after the revolution, France are not that keen to help and to assist the experience of democratic transition. Very, very limited financial aids to Tunisia, which is very, very marginal.
The new democratic Tunisia would see previously banned political parties and movements obtaining the right to run for office. Many of them brought with them new ideas about the direction Tunisia should go in. Some of them were less interested in a close relationship with France. Lively debates on whether to teach English instead of French in schools, whether to hand key projects and contracts to either American or British companies instead of French, and other discussions indicated a section of the country wanted to move away from Paris. In the summer of 2021, President Kais Saied declared he was freezing parliament, suspending his cabinet, and would lead Tunisia by decree. In what his opponents called a coup, Saied staged a crackdown on opponents who he accused of leading Tunisia into an economic and political crisis. His authoritarian tactics were denounced by NGOs and human rights groups. Notably, criticism of the coup was muted in Western capitals, and a few months after it, France gave over $206 million in aid to Tunisia. Additionally, 4 major oil contracts were handed out by French firms, and many Tunisians believe France is playing a crucial role in supporting Saied. Over the course of 2021 and 2022, Saied removed democratic safeguards to consolidate power, including taking over the previously independent Electoral Commission, taking over the courts and dismissing judges, and announcing new elections to replace the frozen parliament. French President Emmanuel Macron voiced support for Tunisia's 17th of December 2022 elections.
Macron didn't hesitate to say that he see that the election would be a good experience for the democracy of Tunisia, which is not the case at all. When it's all the political parties are boycotting this election, it cannot be in any way or another a part of a democracy process.
Events in Tunisia following the downfall of Ben Ali in 2011 would make France very eager to get ahead of changes happening in the region and to step up in neighbouring Libya.
وسنزحف أنا والملايين لتطهير ليبيا شبر شبر، بيت بيت، دار دار، زنقة زنقة، فرد فرد، حتى تطهر البلد من الدنس والإرجاس.
In 2011, the Arab Spring came to Libya after successfully ousting the leaders of Tunisia and Egypt. Protesters took to the streets to demand an end to Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year reign as head of Libya. Gaddafi responded aggressively and his security forces violently cracked down on them. The country very quickly divided and fighting broke out between pro-revolution factions and those aligned with Gaddafi. The Libyan state disintegrated and many regime figures fled Gaddafi's side. Militias formed of tribes loyal to Gaddafi took up arms. Gaddafi's actions and rhetoric caused alarm in European capitals. A large country and 160 nautical miles from Italy's Lampedusa island, a crisis in Libya would have had a major impact on Europe. On top of this, Libya's large oil and gas reserves were crucial for many countries across the world. Relations between Tripoli and the West had been historically tense. In the 1980s, Tripoli was accused of financing terrorism and held responsible for the 1988 Lockerbie bombing. However, in 2003, after the US-led invasion of Iraq toppled the long-term dictator Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi made overtones towards the West. He announced Libya would give up its nuclear weapons program and pay compensation for the Lockerbie bombing. the West was quick to rehabilitate him. France's involvement with Libya was not as extensive as with other North African countries, since Tripoli was historically colonized by the Italians. Even after 2003, Britain and America played the lead role in expanding relations with Gaddafi. France was less important in the later Gaddafi period. That said, within the European Union, Paris was behind Rome in the value of arms deals signed with Tripoli between 2006 to 2009. At least $227 million worth of weapons went from France to Libya. French links with Libya may have gone further than this. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy was accused of financing his 2007 election campaign with Gaddafi's money to the tune of 50 million euros. Sarkozy has always refuted these allegations, but in 2018 he was charged with corruption in relation to the case. In 2020, criminal charges were added and accusations he tried to bribe judges for information on their investigation into his campaign funds. In 2021, he was found guilty and lost his appeal against the decision in May 2023.
The firing continues and the crowd scatters.
Shortly after Muammar Gaddafi launched his violent repression of demonstrations in 2011, the North African country began to unravel and fighting broke out between pro- and anti-Gaddafi forces. Many figures within the Libyan regime fled the country or deserted. As fighting progressed, it looked as if Gaddafi was going to mercilessly destroy the opposition, which led to Western countries deciding to intervene.
They went in and, by sleight of hand, in a sense, they ended by getting rid of Gaddafi.
Whilst there is a lot of debate about why the West went in and whether it was France or the United States who pushed for the intervention, within a few months Gaddafi was dead. However, Libya continued to disintegrate and security challenges multiplied. A number of countries from the Middle East, Europe, Russia and others intensified their involvement in Libya.
The worst thing that happened in 2011-2012 is that what happened to the Libyan army and the Libyan arms dumps. Because part of the Libyan army were Berbers, Tuareg Berbers from Mali, which lies to the south, who had fled Mali in the 1980s, 70s, whenever, because of persecution by their own government, and they'd enrolled with Gaddafi. So when Gaddafi fell, of course, they just decided to go home to Mali, and taking with them a number of very modern weapons, because the arms dumps of Gaddafi were never bombed or destroyed by the Western NATO-led coalition. The Americans or the French or the British seemed to completely forget that they had sold weapons, particularly light weapons, to Gaddafi. So the Tuareg Berbers absconded to Mali with thousands of very modern weapons. And that is what led in 2030 to the near collapse of the regime of Mali in Bamako, the French intervention. And so it's the law of unintended consequences.
Whilst Libya was fractured and a number of militias, including jihadi ones, appeared, the country had formed a government and parliament on paper. However, in 2014, Libya was plunged back into civil war after a former Gaddafi-era military official turned opposition figure to Gaddafi, Khalifa Haftar, went on television and declared the internationally recognised parliament, the General National Congress, had been dissolved. He called for the formation of a new caretaker government, new elections, and for the people to revolt against the GNU. No revolt took place, but as military commander, Haftar was able to raise forces to fight against the GNU. Khalifa Haftar was an experienced military man, and as a young military officer, he helped Gaddafi get into power in the 1969 coup against King Idris. He was promoted and became the top military commander under Gaddafi in 1973. His career seemingly came to an end after he led Libya's ill-fated invasion of Chad in the 1980s. During the 9-year-long war with neighbouring Chad, Haftar and a number of senior military commanders were captured by the Chadian forces. After the war ended, Gaddafi blamed Haftar for the military failure and exiled him. Up until 2011, Haftar appears to have lived in the United States, but the uprising against Gaddafi provided him with an opportunity to return to Libyan politics. After the 2014 civil war erupted, Haftar received support from a number of quarters, including the Gulf states, Egypt, Russia and others. Concerns around the chaos in the North African country and increasing number of Islamist groups led many to throw their support behind the military commander. Haftar also styled himself as an anti-Islamist. While supporting him went against the official wishes of the international community, Paris covertly backed Haftar. It seems like an odd combination to many, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Russia and France backing the same side, but the retreat of the United States from a number of global arenas forced many countries to cobble together strategic alliances with countries on certain issues while being opposed on other issues. Officially, France supported an ending to hostilities in Libya and a peaceful settlement. In 2017, President Emmanuel Macron invited the warring parties to Paris for a peace conference. For Macron, Libya was an opportunity to showcase French prowess and move Paris away from the scandals of President Sarkozy. Notably, at the 2017 conference, Italy was not invited, even though it had a major stake in Libya. Some commentators noted a rising tension between Rome and Paris and interpreted Italy's absence as further proof Macron was trying to push Italy out. While France had been covertly supporting Haftar since 2015, Italy had always backed the GNU and was concerned that Haftar was causing more people to flee Libya. The rupture meant the European Union's response to Libya was fractured. Both Rome and Paris shared concerns over terrorism, the migration crisis, and general instability, but it was also about who gets what in Libya. Both Italian and French oil companies want access to Tripoli's oil fields, and Paris believed Haftar would be the best person to secure its economic interests. Tension sharpened in 2019 after Haftar's forces made it to the outskirts of Tripoli. Both the UK and Italy blasted France for backing it. Paris denied having any prior knowledge of Haftar's plans to take the Libyan capital. However, publicly, French officials offered little comment on the siege of Tripoli, leading to skepticism about French intentions in European capitals. The siege would not succeed. In 2020, Turkey approved military intervention into Libya in support of the GNU, angering France. Ankara became a target for Paris, with the French ramping up tensions between Turkey and its neighbour Greece. By May 2020, Haftar's forces pulled out of Tripoli after suffering heavy losses. His defeat was seen as a defeat for France.
Now, in the last few hours, France has announced it is withdrawing its troops from Mali, where they have been fighting a jihadi insurgency for 10 years.
France's withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Mali in 2022 undermined Paris's claim to be a critical partner in combating extremism in Africa. In 2013, Bamako was facing an armed insurrection from Berber Torang tribes, many of whom had returned to Mali after fighting in Libya against Gaddafi. The tribes wanted independence and formed a breakaway state in northern Mali called Azawad. Calling themselves the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, they were heavily armed due to weapons they obtained in Libya. Mali was disintegrating as a result of a coup in March 2012, which saw soldiers who carried out the coup suspend the constitution. Armed clashes soon broke out between the new government and insurgency groups that popped up, including Al-Qaeda-aligned organizations. The MNLA and these radical groups became allies despite not sharing the same ideological vision. Both saw an opportunity to bring down the regime. France intervened in 2013 to fight the MNLA and jihadi groups and spent years in battle against them. However, in 2022, tensions between Paris and Bamako had reached boiling point, forcing France to leave. Although France's initial 2013 intervention had been successful in bolstering the Malian armed forces and fighting back extremist groups, by 2021, levels of violence were steadily increasing. Besides insurgency, Mali underwent 2 coups in 2020 and 2021 by different factions of the military junta who had ruled the country since 2012. The coups hit at the legitimacy of the French presence. Paris felt the new junta was not serious about tackling growing violence, and the Mali military felt France had broken promises made to it. Malians were angry at the French and suspicious of their motives, leading to large-scale anti-French demonstrations. The junta also brought in Russian mercenaries to help quell the security problem, which further angered the French. Paris's withdrawal had ramifications for its other counter-terrorism operations across the Sahel region, which it was unable to lead. The void left behind was partially filled by Algeria.
Algeria had set up in 2010 a committee called the symbolic, which is a committee which brings together the chief of staff of Niger, Mali, Mauritanian armies and the Algerian army, with the idea that the coordination here could help maintain stability in the region. This was before the Arab Spring. The French brushed it aside, didn't want to have anything to do with it, and when they intervened in 2013, just didn't want the Algerians to have anything to do with all this. And the Algerians said, well, you know, the problem in Mali is a security one, but it's also a political one. You've got to broker negotiations between the different groups, otherwise you get nowhere. And then finally, 11 years later, the French walk away with their tail between their legs and endorse the Algerian position.
After the French withdrawal in 2022, Algeria held a meeting of CMOC in October of the same year, where the chiefs of the Mali, Algerian, Mauritanian and Niger militaries, as well as all the ambassadors of the UN Security Council, the African Union and Germany, called upon the four militaries to restore order in the Sahel. The meeting was a political triumph for Algeria. It was now being recognised as the regional security guarantor. In August 2022, President Emmanuel Macron travelled to Algeria to discuss regional security issues, something which had never really happened before.
There is a big difference, honestly, between the policy of France vis-à-vis Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco, even though, because of course of the resources in Algeria, it is more important and more sensitive as well. But in the same time, they are trying to adopting the policies that maintain their presence and influence on Algeria. In the same time, they don't want to, let's say, provoke the generals there. He visited Algeria with the Prime Minister and the half of the cabinet, more than 16 ministers. He said that he will try to change the policies towards Algeria and to facilitate for example, the visa to the Algerian people, to invest more in Algeria, to give Algeria special and exceptional position.
The issues in West and North Africa are complex. While conflicts in places like Mali are characterized as being caused by Islamist insurgency, the reality is less straightforward, as there are multiple different wars fought between different tribes and groups over things such as land, desertification, self-determination and other issues. North Africa is generally awash, with criminal gangs exploiting instability in Libya, which includes smuggling people, migrants and weapons. Additionally, Colombian and Mexican drug cartels are using routes across the region to smuggle narcotics into the European Union. The feeling is a complex regional-led alliance is needed to bring all of this under control, and Algeria is seen as the crucial player.
Emmanuel Macron last year said that he made a very, very provocative statement against Algeria and especially the Algerian regime, when he said that Algeria had no national identity before the French rule.
The relationship between France and Algeria has always been tense. Unlike Morocco and Tunisia, French rule has always been much more violent and repressive in Algeria. Algeria is where France tested its first nuclear weapon in 1960, and up until the withdrawal in 1962, Algeria was seen as part of France by Paris. Up until 2020, France displayed the skulls of Algerian resistance fighters killed in the 19th century after they revolted against the European Empire. The return of their heads to Algeria by Macron was part of his attempt to improve relations, and since the summer of 2022, Algeria and France have drawn closer together. Additionally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made Algeria a more desirable trading partner for Europe due to the natural gas supply. Algeria is one of the countries that is slated to replace Russian gas in Europe. Both German and Italian oil and gas firms have moved in on Algeria and are seeking to develop the country's industry. However, the closeness to Algeria has caused a crisis between France and Morocco. Morocco and Algeria share a long border. In 1962, following Algerian independence, a war erupted between the two countries over the border demarcation lines. They eventually normalized relations and agreed on border lines. Relations hit a rock bottom in 1976 when Algeria, alongside a number of other African countries, decided to recognize the Polisario Front's declaration of independence for the Western Sahara, a territory Rabat claims sovereignty over. Western Sahara had been a Spanish colony up until 1975, when in the last days of General Francisco Franco, Madrid signed an agreement with both Morocco and Mauritania to hand over control to both countries. By 1979, Mauritania pulled out due to pressure by the Polisario Front, but Morocco stayed and extended its military control. Algeria backed separatist rebels due to Algiers' concerns about Moroccan territorial claims to part of Algeria. While both countries have reconciled on numerous occasions, tension between them, especially over Western Sahara, flare up from time to time. Rabat has historically been a close ally of Paris, but Algeria's ascendancy has angered decision makers in the North African country. Relations have gotten so bad that in the summer of 2022, when King Mohammed VI arrived in Paris, he had to wait a few days before President Macron would see him. Morocco and France entered into a difficult phase of their relationship in 2015 when French justice decided to pursue the head of Moroccan intelligence for his alleged role in the torture of a French Moroccan national. In 2021, it was unveiled that Paris suspected a number of French politicians and officials, including the French president, were under Moroccan surveillance after Pegasus spyware owned by an Israeli firm was found on their phones. These tensions had been kept beneath the surface, but the improving relationship with Algeria brought them to the fore.
Morocco traditionally bought weapons in America and France. And in the last year or so, it's been sourcing weapons in Israel, and this is making the French very, very uncomfortable. And I think that the Moroccans felt they'd won, they'd scored a major victory when the Americans, Jared Kushner, engineered this, when Trump recognized just before leaving the White House that Western Sahara was part of Morocco.
The 2020 US recognition of Morocco's claims to Western Sahara was tied to improving relations between Tel Aviv and Rabat. Israel entering into North Africa provides another alternative to Paris for Morocco. Morocco's defiance of France has led to Paris cutting the number of visas issued to Moroccans, especially Moroccan elites, and has seen a reduction in ministerial visits between the two countries. What has made this dispute even worse is Morocco sought out Russian help to build nuclear power plants instead of using French firms. France is also being challenged by rivals from other European countries. In 2021, Spain recognized Moroccan claims to Western Sahara in a secret letter to Rabat, which the Moroccans leaked to the media. The move angered Algiers, who reduced trade with Madrid in protest. During the 2022 CMOC meeting, the Spanish were not invited. The collapse of empire left the French searching for a new role in the world. The Cold War meant that under the guise of the US global anti-communism drive, Paris was able to assert itself as both knowing the terrain in North Africa and willing to use its influence to push back the Red forces. The end of the Cold War did not end the French role, but it did lead to questions about why it was in the region. 9/11 and the War on Terror gave it a renewed sense of purpose, but the Arab Spring, failed interventions in Mali and Libya, and the diversification of geopolitical relationships in North Africa have weakened the image of Paris. While the last few years do not mean France's influence is over, they do mean it has reached a crossroads, and where it goes from here will determine whether it sinks or swims. Whatever happens, France must accept that there is no going back, and the North African region is going to be more diverse and independent in the future.